the wake of the American massacre of civilians at My Lai and the open corruption of the U.S.-backed government in Saigon, as well as reports of drug abuse among some of our soldiers in Vietnam, Richard Nixon suspended the Paris peace talks in 1972. The Viet Cong launched a major military offensive, and we resumed bombing Haiphong and mined its harbor. To the relief of many in Hollywood, Jane did not make mention of any of this when she accepted the Academy Award for her role in Clute. Her ceasefire did not last long. Jane's brimstone passion was flaunted before the House Committee on Internal Security, but she was finding the revolutionary life exhausting and lonely. Inevitably, she would link up with another firebrand she'd first viewed years earlier on television during the riots surrounding the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago. Tom Hayden, the founder of SDS, the most violent and virulent of student groups, was an infamous member of the Chicago Seven, one the government tried but couldn't convict.
The first portion of the trial, we feel, has shown conclusively that it was the city of Chicago and not ourselves who was responsible for the violence that occurred last year, because the city of Chicago refused to negotiate time and time again with either the Yippies or the protesters against the war in Vietnam.
The only child of a Detroit blue-collar Irish Catholic family, Hayden had assaulted the American establishment and become a national figure in the process. His combining forces with Fonda became a curiosity to many and an obsession for Washington freelance journalist Max Friedman, a long-time and hostile chronicler of Hayden, a man he considered a ruthless opportunist.
He was always in there, always planning, always meeting with people, always demonstrating, always visible, always doing something for 10 years. No break. The others dropped off often after the Chicago 7 trial.
The Fonda-Hayden-Hanoi connection did not go unnoticed at the National Security Council, where Dolph Droz served under both LBJ and Nixon.
The Hanoi people were looking for something that could destroy the spirit and the unity of the home capital of their opponent, the United States of America. And they found that, to their amazement, it was the richest people in America, the movie celebrities in America, who were most ignorant about politics and would be most willing to serve the North Vietnamese, even when they were merely blinded and ignorant Judas goats.
Some well-intentioned Americans did travel to Hanoi, although U.S. officials suspected all visits were coordinated by the North Vietnamese to coincide with anti-war demonstrations back home. Peter Arnett, now a CNN newsman, was sent behind the enemy lines by the Associated Press.
I felt then, and I feel now, that all Americans who went to Hanoi were manipulated to one degree or another by the North Vietnamese. On the other hand, all Americans who went to North Vietnam, to Hanoi, were, in a sense, manipulating the communist side. You know, what was the motivation of Jane Fonda going? I mean, she wanted to end the war, but then she was giving interviews left, right, and center, and came home and talked about it. My motivation in going to Hanoi was to get a lot of good news stories. I don't think the North Vietnamese ever had any doubts that they would deliberately use us for all they could get from us.
Emotionally, Jane was devastated. None of the propaganda from either side of the conflict prepared her for the carnage she encountered. She embraced their cause, and her every word of encouragement was trumpeted by a military interpreter.
That visit and the support it showed for Vietnam had great impact on the thinking of the Vietnamese people. We realized there were two Americans, one who dropped bombs on us and another who supported us, who had sympathy for our struggle for independence and freedom.
Alone and without Tom to advise her, Jane allowed her every move to be strategically plotted by the North Vietnamese, who found her an eager accomplice. Colonel George Day was interned in the POW camp facetiously called the Hanoi Hilton when Jane was paraded through. He developed a harsh opinion of her actions.
It was worse than just being manipulated and used. She got into that with all her heart. She wanted the North Vietnamese to win. And she caused the death of an unknown amount of Americans by continually buoying up their morale at times when they were down and keeping them in the fight. That's not what anyone would expect from Henry Fonda's daughter.
Then Senator George McGovern, a peace candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination, had mixed feelings about Jane's ultimate decision to see for herself what was going on in North Vietnam.
She believed very strongly that that war had to be stopped and that maybe a trip to Hanoi might reach some people that you couldn't reach with normal protest. I think it was a mistaken tactic. I think it hurt her.
Shown wounded civilians and destroyed homes and hospitals, Jane also was escorted to other camps where some POWs were amenable to meeting her. Michael Binge, an incarcerated civilian agricultural expert, was very anxious to describe to Jane in detail the routine torture of prisoners.
She was making a hero out of a very unlikely character. Ho Chi Minh in the Revolution, just like Hollywood made heroes out of Bonnie and Clyde, made heroes out of Jesse and Frank James, and made hero out of Billy the Kid. These were all killers. And so she was living in a world of fantasy.
What happened to you when you refused to speak well of your conditions for Jane Fonda?
When I went into this, the political commissar of our camp got very angry with me. And as a result of my quite frank remarks, and I had again reiterated that I would like to really tell her the truth, you know, of the experience that I had. And so Jane, or not Jane, I mean the political commissar then made me kneel down on my knees on rocks on a concrete floor, hold out my hands like this with a piece of heavy metal reinforcing rod on the end of my hands and remain that way. I spent about 2 days on my knees that way. And whenever my hands would become too tired to hold him up, then I would be beaten by him.
Jane's turncoat tour of North Vietnam would seem impossible to surpass, but she would outdo herself and do herself in when she volunteered to make radio broadcasts for the enemy.